Praise be to God, naked being, who wears the universe as its body, and whose name is I. Praise be to God, the amness of all selves, although there are no selves, and the isness of all things, although there are no things. Praise be to God who conceals himself in existence and reveals himself as being. Praise be to God who shrouds herself in time and proclaims herself in eternity. Praise be to God, whose movement is our longing, whose rest is peace itself. Praise be to God, for whom the world is its song, and silence its prayer. Yesterday we used the analogy of the relationship between the physical space of the universe and the space in each of our rooms, to show that there is, in fact, no relationship between the two, because they are not two in the first place to be related. There is just a single infinite and indivisible space. And we use this analogy to show the complete absence of any distinction between our being and God's being. Our being can never be placed in relationship to God's being, because a relationship can only exist between two entities, and being is one. So there is no question of an individual either being separated from or united with God's being. The individual self and the universal self are the same self, if we can call it a self. The Atman and the Paramatman, for those of you that have been brought up in the Vedantic tradition, are one. In the Christian tradition, I and my Father are one. The separation between ourself, between our being and God's being, was only ever a belief. And there is nothing one can do about a belief other than ceasing to believe it. It cannot be, the distinction between our being and God's being cannot be got rid of. It is not there to begin with. The belief in the separation of our being from God's being is like a line drawn in the sand, which of course does not separate anything from anything. It is all made of sand. And it is for this reason that in the Vedantic tradition, this the separate self is not really referred to as a separate self. It is referred to as ignorance, or the illusion of ignorance. There is no real separate self there. There is just the ignoring of our true nature, the overlooking of our true nature. That's all there is to the apparently separate self, this apparent forgetting. In the Christian tradition, this illusion of ignorance is referred to as sin. It has a moralistic connotation that is not contained in the word ignorance. Sin is just the belief that we exist as a being apart from God's being. And any action that is considered a sin is simply an action that comes from the sense of separation. Any action that is initiated by the feeling of separation is considered, from this point of view, to be a sin. And it is for this reason in this tradition that we don't spend time exploring the character, disciplining, improving, developing, getting rid of the character. All that is necessary is to know oneself as one essentially is, this knowing of our own being. Nothing ever happens to our being. It is always in the same perfect, whole, undivided, inherently peaceful, unconditionally fulfilled condition. And in order to discover the nature of our being in this way, we first turn away from the content of experience. It could be called interior prayer, where we withdraw the mind from the content of experience and we keep the mind, we sink the mind into the sanctuary of the heart. When thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast closed thy door, pray to thy Father who is in secret. This entering into thy closet and closing the door, it is to sink the mind into the heart, close the door of perception, turn away from the content of experience, and pray to thy Father who is in secret. That is, rest one's mind in simply being, which cannot be known by the mind. The cloud of unknowing that is darkness to the mind. This sinking of the mind into the sanctuary of the heart is the surrendering of the apparently separate self to God's presence, infinite being. As Ramana Maharshi said, one who is steadily established in one's being, giving not the slightest room to the arising of any thought, alone is surrendering oneself to God. So thus far we have talked about this interior prayer. Where we turn our attention away from the content of experience. But if it was only possible to pray in this way, then it would be impossible to, as they say in the Orthodox Church, to pray without ceasing, because we spend much of our lives with our eyes open, engaged in activities and relationships. So at some stage our understanding of prayer must expand to include the content of our experience. Thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions, activities and relationships. We could call it exterior prayer, or prayer in the presence of our experience rather than its absence. And in order to take us in this direction, I'd like to explain about the relationship between being and existence. I don't want to get too philosophical about this, because I want to keep this time together very experiential, not theoretical. But I feel that an understanding of what is meant by these two words is necessary to inform this very experiential attitude to prayer in the face of our objective experience. So, as many of you who have attended my meetings before know, the word existence comes from two Latin words, ex meaning out of, and sistere meaning to stand, implying that something that exists stands out from its background. Be that thing a thought, a feeling, a sensation, the sound of my voice, the sight of your room, an object. Whatever it is, whatever we experience objectively, exists. It stands out from its background. It exists in its background, and then it merges into it. What is the background from which all existent things emerge? Being. So the two words being and existence, although closely related, are not synonymous when properly understood. That which exists has a name and a form. It is that which emerges out of the background of being with some form. Anything that exists has a form. an extension in time and or space. That from which all existent things emerge itself has no form. That is being. So being is formless. And being formless, there is nothing finite in it. It is infinite. Having nothing in itself other than itself. It is indivisible. It is one. Now, whatever emerges out of being, by definition, has a form and a name. And its form and its name distinguishes it from everything else that has a form or a name. So whatever exists is by definition limited. So it is this unlimited, formless, indivisible being that manifests itself as a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves. The analogy that I often use is the screen and the movie. The screen is one thing, transparent, empty, indivisible. The movie is, or seems to be, appears to be many things, many colours, many shapes, many forms. So the movie is to the screen in the same relationship as existence is to being. We could upgrade our analogy of the screen and the movie to a space and a hologram. The empty, infinite, indivisible space would represent being, and the hologram would be the appearance of multiplicity and diversity that empty space assumes. So the name God refers to this infinite, indivisible, formless being from which everyone and everything emerges, from which everyone and everything derives its apparently independent existence. I say apparently independent existence because just as no character or object in a movie really exists on its own right or in its own right, independent of the screen, but is just a colouring of the screen, as no object that appears in a hologram really exists in its own right, but is just a modulation of the empty space. So, whatever exists in reality, the world, the universe, doesn't exist in its own right. It does not have its own being. Its being is God's being, the only being there is. It derives its apparent existence from that which truly is infinite being, God's being. In other words, nothing truly exists. This is not a life-denying, philosophical, nihilistic statement. On the contrary, if properly understood, it is an affirmation of God's being. It is the equivalent in the Sufi tradition, in the Muslim tradition, when they say La ilaha illallah, they mean there is no God but God. No thing has its own being, independent of God's being. Everything borrows its apparent reality from the only reality there is, God's intimate, infinite, impersonal, indivisible being. And we find this understanding. This understanding is the foundation of not only the great religious and spiritual traditions, but it is the foundation of all the great true philosophical traditions. It stands at the foundation of Western philosophy, just as it does Eastern philosophy. In both the Bhagavad Gita and Parmenides, in almost identical words, it says, "That which is never ceases to be. That which is not never comes into existence." That which is infinite, indivisible being never ceases to be. It never disappears because there is nothing prior to it into which it could disappear, just as it did not emerge in the first place, because there is nothing prior to it from which it could have emerged. That which is never ceases to be. It eternally is. Before Abraham was, I am. I, God's infinite being, am eternally present now. That which is not never comes into existence. That which is not, that is, the objects, the selves, the entities, the people, the things that seem to exist, that seem to have their own discrete and independent existence, never come into existence. That is, they never really stand out from the background of being with their own independent reality. They are simply a colouring, a modulation of that which truly is. Remember Balayani, do not fall into the error of those who believe that, I'm paraphrasing now, that those do not fall into the error of those who believe that God created things. There are no things. There is just God every day in a different configuration. Don't impose this understanding on yourself from the outside. Feel it in your heart and allow it to gradually inform your perceptions from the inside, so that the way we perceive, that is, the way we see, hear, smell, touch, taste, and indeed the way we think and feel, is gradually and progressively pervaded by this understanding, transformed by this understanding. Our sense perceptions become suffused with God's being. The world no longer veils God's being, but begins to shine with it. When I was in boarding school in England from the age of 8, every Sunday we would go home for the day, and on Sunday evening, after coming back to school, there would always be a chapel service. And in this service we would always sing the same hymn every night, every Sunday night, for 5 years. And this hymn is always associated in my mind with the homesickness I felt on Sunday evenings. But it was only later that I realized it was associated with a much deeper homesickness, a nostalgia for this way of seeing that did not obscure reality, did not obscure God's presence, but shone with it. And to this day, I maintain this habit of reciting this beautiful short hymn on Sunday evenings, a kind of childish habit that I have maintained. God be in my head and in my understanding. God be in my eyes and in my looking. God be in my mouth and in my speaking. God be in my heart and in my thinking. God be at my end and at my departing. Do not allow the apparent multiplicity and diversity of people and things to persuade you that there is anything in reality other than God's infinite being. When my son Matthew was young, we used to take him to the 3D IMAX cinema in the Science Museum in London, and as any of you who have been to such a cinema will know, when you go in, you're given a pair of goggles, and you put the goggles on, and what would otherwise be a fuzzy two-dimensional image on the screen in front of you becomes this 3D environment in which you are a participant. So we would find ourselves in the middle of an ocean surrounded by fish and sharks and corals and reeds, and every now and then I would take my goggles off and look around me and see not just the children but a lot of the adults too, reaching out with their hands to catch the fish as they went by. And of course, all they found was empty space. I'm told that it won't be long before the impression of three-dimensional space and objects in a 3D cinema like this will, before such an image is accompanied by sensory experience, so that when you reach out your hand, you will actually feel that your hand is in water or touching a fish. But even then, even as we actually feel we are touching the water and the fish, all that will be there will be empty space. Consider that the reality that we live in, this universe, this world, is some kind of a hologram whose reality is God's infinite being. That is the stuff we touch, we taste, we smell, we see, we hear. Except, of course, in this hologram, it's accompanied. not just a visual impression, it's accompanied by sounds and tastes and textures, but the only stuff that is being experienced is God's being. And who is it that would be touching or perceiving or knowing God's being? There is no room in God's being for any other being. It's not that we as separate selves are seeing God's being manifesting as the world. We are the eyes of God through which it sees itself as the world. The universe is God's body, and we as living beings are its sense organs. Think of the way we as apparent individuals perceive. We just perceive through our eyes and ears and nose. We don't perceive through our kneecaps or our ankles. Although we are one body, we still see or experience or perceive from a small portion of that body, our eyes, our ears, our nose. Consider the universe God's body. But God perceives the universe only from selected locations within that universe. That is, each of us. We are God's sense organs. The means by which God's infinite being perceives itself as a universe. And what is it when we go into the 3D IMAX cinema? What is it that renders the fuzzy two-dimensional image into a three-dimensional world? It is the glasses that we wear, the goggles that we look through. Consider that the activities of thought and perception are the goggles that God wears, the medium through which infinite consciousness perceives its own reality. And just as it is the nature of the goggles that render the two-dimensional image a three-dimensional world, so it is the nature of thought and perception that renders God's infinite being the world we perceive. It is thought and perception that refracts God's infinite being, the unity of being, into a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves. So, I don't remember whether it was St. Matthew or St. John who said, "When thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast closed thy door, pray to thy Father who is in secret." But he might have written another verse. "When thou prayest, open thy door, come out of thy closet. See God's infinite being, who doesn't just lie in secret behind the world, but manifests itself as the world." So in this second stage of prayer, we take prayer out of the closet, out of our heart, into the world. Prayer progressively ceases to be something special that we do at certain times during the day. Our thoughts, our feelings, our perceptions, our sensations, our activities, our relationships, all of these become prayers made manifest. Our life becomes a prayer. There is no longer any question of having to guard the candle in the wind, because the world has caught fire. It is shining with God's being, ablaze with God's being. We may still choose from time to time. I certainly do this, to enter into the closet, to close the door, to turn the mind away from its content, and allow oneself to rest in being. As being. But this would not essentially be any different from one's everyday life in the world. It would just be a different mode of the same experience. This is the vision of the world that artists and poets give us. The world is not what we see, it is the way we see. If we look at the world through the lens of separation, through the filter of belief that we are a temporary, finite being, then the world will appear in accordance with that belief as a multiplicity and diversity of discrete, distinct, unrelated objects. But to the extent that our being has been divested of its limitations, so the world will appear to us accordingly. What previously seemed to conceal God's being now reveals God's being, now shines with it. And wonder is one of the characteristics of this way of seeing. Mary Oliver wrote a poem called When Death Comes. And in it she says, "When it's over, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride, married to amazement. I was the bridegroom, taking the world into my arms." William Blake, one of the great masters of the Western Tantric tradition, was trying to explain this perspective to one of his friends one of his skeptical friends. And his friend said to him, "Do you mean to say that when you see the sun rise, you do not see a round disk of fire somewhat like a guinea?" To which William Blake replied, "Oh, no, 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 I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host, crying, 'Glory, glory, glory is the Lord God Almighty.'" So these are the two aspects of prayer. The inward aspect and the outward aspect. The inward aspect is the aspect that was emphasized and best described in the Vedantic tradition and in the mystical Christian tradition and Sufi tradition. And the outward aspect of prayer was best described in the Tantric traditions, Kashmir Shaivism, Dzogchen, and of course in the studios and studies of artists and poets. But all these traditions recognize that one must first take the inward-facing path. In order to know what reality is, we must first know what our self is. So the first stage is this inner prayer, where we enter the closet of the heart, the sanctuary of the heart, close the door, turn away from objective experience, sink the mind, rest the mind in pure being. And then, having touched or recognized the unlimited and indivisible nature of our being, we take this understanding out into the world and allow it to inform not just our thoughts and our feelings, but our actions and relationships. So the first pathway, the inner prayer, interior prayer, is the divesting of our being of all the limitations that it acquires from experience, the revelation of the pure I am. And then, as we turn outward again, the exterior prayer, when we realize that I am, that infinite being, is the reality of everyone and everything. And these two aspects of prayer were beautifully expressed by my first teacher, the Shankaracharya, who said this: before you can begin to be what you are, you have to come out of what you are not. You are not those worn-out opinions, those turning thoughts, those changing feelings, that separate ego. Well then, what are you? You will find that when you have come out of what you are not, that the birds in the trees are singing to you, I am that. The water in the stream is bubbling to you, I am that. The sun and the moon are shining beacons to you, I am that. And you are in everything in the world, and everything in the world is in you.